we have a couple of things to do this afternoon. One of which later on will be to share the concluding thoughts, the priorities and recommendations from each of the 6 thematic sessions. And there's a clear purpose about why we've been doing all this that we will be talking about some more. But for this session, we wanted to just reflect for a little bit of time on what this whole agenda of a Scotland without poverty might look like from the stance of 2 outstanding leaders in the charitable sector who work in different ways but will have some really interesting common views, I think, to share with us. And they are Jackie Killeen, who is Chief Executive of Big Lottery in Scotland, and Julia Unwin, Chief Executive of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, also known as the boss, for me at least. So I'm on my best behaviour. Anyway, we could scarcely have 2 better people to try and interpret the complex changes we're living through, which we've heard about a bit: demographic changes, job market changes, housing changes, cost of living pressures. And to understand what that agenda looks like across the map of Scotland and the whole of the UK, and more than that, more than have an understanding and to be able to analyse those changes, but to do something about it in terms of demonstration activity, grant funding activity, and just being alongside people who are having the toughest time, the people and the places which are experiencing poverty. So we are delighted that they have agreed to join us today. And please join me in welcoming, first of all, Jackie Killeen. Jackie.
Thank you very much, Jim, and I don't think I'm going to be able to live up to that introduction, but I'll do my best. I'm also going to try and operate with more pieces of paper and devices than I have hands for, so bear with me slightly. And first of all, can I check that I'm audible? Great, thank you, although you may come to regret saying yes about that. What I'd like to do, if it's okay, over the next few minutes is say a little bit about what the Big Lottery Fund tries to do, who we try to work with, and in particular what we've been trying to achieve in Scotland over the past 5 years. I'd like to say a little bit about what's changed in that time and what we've seen change in that time and how we've responded to that. And then probably most importantly, I'd like to say and I'd like to ask something about what comes next, because we're at a bit of a crossroads now in terms of our own priorities, in terms of our own work, and in terms of what we do next to help achieve this ambition in Scotland. So for the second part, I'd like to try and focus on how we can help people like you and organisations more broadly to achieve the aspiration of a Scotland without poverty. So, making sure that moves right direction. Okay. So, many of you will probably know us. Our mission for the Big Lottery Fund across the UK is to bring real improvements to communities and the lives of people most in need. We are very much committed to trying to build a Scotland without poverty. I suppose we've understood poverty in quite a broad way over the last few years. We've been looking at people's lives, people's life chances, people's opportunities, how they vary depending on where they live, the backgrounds they've had, the people that they come into contact with, the job markets, etc. And we've tried to identify how we can help to improve and make positive changes there. We've probably also simultaneously tried to build stronger and more vibrant communities and go with the grain of what people in neighbourhoods and in communities have wanted to do. And finally, we've probably also tried to tackle some very specific and particular issues and challenges. So, broadly, what we've done is we've funded thousands of grassroots groups in communities in every part of Scotland to come together to do things that are positive and important to them. We've done this primarily through small grants that go to grassroots organisations, and they fund everything from girl guiding activity to day trips for people with disabilities to lunch groups for pensioners to football strips. We fund an awful lot of football strips, to beekeeping, to allotment. Basically, if there is something that a group wants to come together around, an interest that will bring people together at the local level, we try and make funding available for them to be able to do that in an easy way. And we fund about 3,000 of those a year. Also, over the last 5 years, we funded hundreds of third sector organisations to support people, families and communities to have better chances. For example, a better start in life by supporting parents, particularly parents who have challenging circumstances to address. We've focused particularly in the last 5 years on young people who have been in the care system and their life chances and their outcomes when they move on from that. We focused a lot in the last 5 years on the transitions in and out of work and how people can make more positive and sustained transitions. And we focused an awful lot on the connections and the support that enable older people to stay connected and happy and healthy in their homes for as long as they want to in their communities. We've also focused on some very specific issues. We've focused on domestic abuse. It's been a big priority for us. In that, we have been trying to look at what can be practically done to help women, but not just women, people who've experienced domestic abuse and their children to move on and to have a more positive future. So we've looked at and supported the kinds of recovery that we know to be effective for children, and we have focused quite intensively, most recently, on housing. So how people who are leaving a domestic abuse situation can end up in homes of their choice, and that's quite a complex arena. We've looked at issues like workplace inequality, in different ways, from access to higher opportunities to particularly marginalised groups who don't get those opportunities in the first place. And we've looked at issues around integration. So if you're a refugee or asylum seeker, how can you be supported to join and play a full part in the community that you're going to live in? And we've also, and this has been an ongoing part of our work for the last 10 years really, we've helped many communities to become stronger and more in charge of what happens to them in the future through having greater control of their local assets and their local resources. We've done this through a programme called Growing Community Assets, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute, but also through a programme called Our Place. And with both of those, there's a key fundamental principle, which is people living together in a neighbourhood or an area should be able to have a greater say around what happens to that community in the future, and they should be more in control of those decisions and those resources. So I'll say a little bit about that in a minute. But I suppose the key change is that at the outset of this plan 5 years ago, those are all the things we expected to be doing, and those were all the things we planned to be doing. So we knew we would be focusing on grassroots work. We knew we would be focusing on some preventative work. We knew we would be focusing in on those specific issues and challenges. What we didn't expect to be doing was focusing on sharply rising levels of material need. And we didn't expect to be asked to be funding food banks, very intensive levels of advice projects and support. We didn't expect to be funding furniture reuse projects at quite the scale that we have. Something that brought us closer to emergency rather than preventative work. And so in the last 2 years, we found ourselves adding another dimension to our work, and that has been very much around supporting work to mitigate poverty and really quite sharp and hard need. So over the last 5 years, we've seen a shift, and we've tried to adapt and respond to that. I might need some technical help on this one. This is a sign that I've gone on too long for that first slide. So It's a stop wittering sign. Thank you. It's only another nice picture on the next slide anyway, so. So this is one of my favourite places in the world. It's Maryhill Borough Halls in Glasgow. And I suppose if I think about what does building vibrant communities look like for us, it looks a lot like this. I know this is a building, but trust me, there are lots of people who do a lot of work in and around this and get a lot of benefit from it. So the sort of work which supported the redevelopment of Maryhill Borough Halls as a community-owned and community-managed asset is one example of building a stronger and more vibrant community. We funded Maryhill Borough Halls Trust to the tune of just under £1 million from Growing Community Assets. This was a group who wanted to renovate what they described, and which we believe them, to be one of Glasgow's most treasured buildings and restore it to its former glory, its important place in the community, but also as a community-owned and community-managed asset. Through the refurbishment and the new build, they've developed a viable and increasingly, in the longer term, self-supporting building that offers facilities for the local community, as well as flexible facilities for business, for third sector organisations, for social economy and community groups. What it does beautifully is bring together the local community to enjoy everything from social gatherings, sports, arts, leisure activities, and also provide practically office space, short-term leases for business. They have a pretty impressive range of existing tenants, including a local Primrose nursery, fusion music studios, some architects are based there, a dance company is based there, some accountants are based there, a housing association has an office there, and some other groups. The Trust owns and manages the halls. The board of the Trust is mostly made up of people who live and work in Maryhill. However, the day-to-day running of the activities are delivered by volunteers with a very small core staff. Since its opening, they have held over 500 different events for 60 different groups, from charities, training, performance. Last month I went to see National Theatre of Scotland's very disturbing, strange undoing of Prudencia Hart there, but it was a great place to do it. They've had weddings, they've had birthday parties. I suppose what I'm trying to say is it's a thriving asset in the heart of a local community that's really important to the community, that they made happen, that they're treasuring, they're in charge of, and meets all those needs. And what we'd like to do is see more of that happening in more parts of Scotland. And a really important part of what we do is to try and get behind those aspirations and those ambitions when people have them. Alongside that, we have something called Our Place, which works at the very granular level in neighbourhoods to try and bring local people together to say, what do we want to change? What do we like? What can we build on in our area? So neighbourhood is very important to us. We know neighbourhood is very important to everybody. And this is kind of, if we were thinking very positively, this is what we would like to see happening. We would like to see more of this happening. But as I mentioned, over the last couple of years, we've placed more of an emphasis on work that is actually about mitigating the rise in poverty and material need across Scotland. And we've done this because people have asked us to. We saw this first through small grants programmes where alongside the beekeeping and the allotments and the Girl Guides and the Boy Scouts and the football strips and the day trips, we saw people asking us to run breakfast clubs, to run food banks, to run parcel distribution services, to do clothes recycling. And that was because people saw a need on their doorsteps in their community and they wanted to step in and do something about it. We also then saw many of the organisations we work with in our main big grants programmes ask us for things that those big programmes weren't really equipped to be providing. So we're talking about more long-term work that helps people avoid debt or helps people choose the right path in life, and instead people were asking us for help around huge numbers of people coming to them for very practical and specific advice. So we had to change what we were doing a little bit, and we developed a programme called Support and Connect. And in the last year alone, we've invested £19 million to 123 Support and Connect projects across Scotland. That's provided grants of between £10,000 and £350,000 to support people experiencing hardship in a range of ways by providing welfare advice, financial advice, clothing, household goods, or that are addressing food or fuel poverty. And what's very important to us is that if we're providing that support and if we're giving that resource to people who are providing that, we want to make sure that that resource is connected up at the local level. So the connect has been as important as the support. But our question is really, how much of this should we be doing in future? This isn't where we set out to be 5 years ago. We've seen the need and we've seen the challenge groups, organisations and communities are facing. We've developed this response in order to help address this. And I guess one of my questions for you is, for a funder like us, with the resources we've got, how much of this should be our core territory in the future? So, we'd like to be able to continue to do both, to address disadvantage, but to help build vibrant communities. And the question is how and what's the balance? How much of this do we factor into our long-term plans? What's our ongoing role in helping build vibrant communities, resilient and connected and resourced individuals and families, and addressing this growing sharp level of material need? Can we do more and better to build those vibrant communities while still addressing disadvantage? Are there better ways that we can do that? I suppose that's one of our questions. And the reason that this is very good timing for us is that we are now just at the point where we stop, reflect, ask you what should be the balance of our work over the next 6 years. So our plan that I talked about, all the funding that we've been distributing, the programs we've had, they take us up until the middle of 2015. We need to now develop what are our approaches, what are our priorities for the 6 years after that. And we've sort of set it out like this, and we're really keen to hear as broad a range of perspectives and views on this as we can possibly get, which is one of the many reasons I'm glad to be here today. So we need to be an active listener in this debate to make sure that the work that we're doing provides part of the necessary resource and infrastructure to combat poverty, but also to create hope, to create that opportunity and that possibility that things can get better, people can do things for themselves, change is possible. And so we're looking at these 4 themes as the basis for that. So building vibrant communities, we've seen an example of that. Addressing disadvantage, so both the sharp disadvantage that I've talked about that we've seen through Support and Connect projects, but the more deep-seated and ongoing structural disadvantage, I guess, that we're more familiar with. What's the role of building a stronger third sector in that, and how can we do that working with organisations, I suppose, like many of the organisations that you work with? If you're going to be, and if you have been, as we've seen, carrying the mantle for this, what's our role in supporting you to do that? And who else do we need to be working with, and how can we do that? How can we do this more collaboratively? So I suppose that's where we are, and that's what we're interested in. As things stand, we can't influence or shape or change the fundamental structural issues that I'm sure you have been talking about over the last couple of days. So we can't change the taxation system or influence how social security is provided. Our role is about resourcing people and organisations and communities in the best way that we possibly can to enable them to bring about change. And you're all very welcome as members of this Assembly to share your views and your perspectives and your experiences with us, so that the priorities that we choose, because there is a finite level of resource available and some choices do have to be made, so that what we choose to do is the best that it can be to bring about the most positive impact that we can on that journey to helping Scotland eradicate poverty. So I'd like to finish by making an open invitation for you to talk to us. We'll come and talk to anybody. Ask Andrew, who has been here for the last couple of days, to get in touch via the platforms that are here to write something for us, to be provocative, to be challenging, to say, actually, all of that, you need to start all over again. We're up for and open to all of that at the moment. And in effect, we're at your disposal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jackie. I'm just thinking on your final point there, this is not an audience that has to be asked twice to be provocative. So I'm sure you will get some responses to that. And the point about good timing is well made. Something else you said that echoed from yesterday, interestingly, you're making that point about what balance should be struck by a funder of largely the third sector. And we heard the Housing Minister yesterday, Margaret Burgess, make a similar point, saying the Scottish Government did not expect to have to be introducing an emergency food aid programme or having to work quite so hard to mitigate the impact of choices made by others. So there's an interesting commonality there about how far you might be having to depart from what you thought you'd be doing by necessity and legitimately, but nonetheless, what does that mean for the future is a great question, which I know that Julia will pick up too. So, as I said, Julia Unwin is Chief Executive of JRF, but also the Joseph Rowntree Housing Trust, and one of the great strengths of the Rowntree network of organisations is that they don't just go and fund great research and find out what's happening. There's a chance to work out what that means for tenants and for people using the care services in the north of England. So there's a groundedness and a reality check about all the work that's done by JRF and the Housing Trust and its sister organisations. I should also say, as a final point before Julia speaks, that Julia was recently voted one of the top 20 social media social enterprise leaders of the UK. So Ross and his colleagues will be happy to hear that sometimes we think that what we do in social media doesn't make an impact. It's often noticed, and it's great that Julia got that award. She may even have some tips for us on the effective use of social media. But please welcome Julia Unwin. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Jackie, as well, for that incredibly inspirational response explaining what can be done by a big funder, called BIG, working with small community organisations. I wanted to start by welcoming the fact of this assembly. It is far too easy in our world for academics to talk to academics, for practitioners to get into huddles, and for people and places in poverty to be left outside the room. And what I think is so powerful about this assembly is the way in which you've brought together all the players who can really make a difference. Because for Joseph Rowntree Foundation, an organisation absolutely wedded to pursuing lasting social change, it is in our DNA that we are focusing on dealing with the root causes of social disadvantage, and by saying that, I'm quoting Joseph Rowntree, by looking at research, by delivering services in order to influence that change. But we know that the evidence comes from research that we commission and many, many others commission. From the work that is done by organisations across the UK and indeed across the world, many of them funded by Jackie's organisation, and by the lived experience of people whose voices we need to understand and listen to. Unless those of us who are activists or commissioners of research or academics come with some humility to this debate, we are in very real danger of dividing our movement. And I'm going to argue now that never has it been more important that we come together with a very shared, clear, and very honest discussion about where we want to get to, which in this discussion is about what would Scotland look like if it was poverty-free. For Joseph Rowntree Foundation, our concern is with the 4 nations of the UK. How can we eradicate poverty across the 4 nations? We've worked on this stuff for decades. We've published a huge amount of research. We've become a major living wage employer in our home city in York. We're doing all sorts of bits and pieces. And I think they all together really matter. But they are as nothing unless we work with activists, with people who've got experience, and with all of those of you in the room. So my first start is to congratulate the Assembly for pulling all of this together. We emerged from the worst, deepest recession that any of us have ever lived through. I can say this with confidence because the last very deep recession was in the 30s, and I suspect there's nobody here who lived through that. We emerged from this recession in a really different place from the one we went into it. I'm not surprised that Big have had to change some of their spending. I'm not surprised that the Scottish Government has had to redress what we've all had to change. We emerge into a different world. And I just want to pull out a few things about that world before going on to say what I think we need to do. We emerge into a world where the labour market is very different from the one that we were facing 10, 15 years ago. The current labour market, what I've described as the murky end of the labour market, is a labour market in which there is very little security, very little progression, very low wages, and very little certainty of what will happen to you next. It's a labour market in which the routes from poorly paid, unreliable work to well-paid work are extremely hard to find. It's a labour market that, because of globalisation, because of automation, looks different from the labour market we were used to. And many of our systems, many of our practices are set up to assume we have a labour market in which once you get into it, you're basically going to be all right. Talking to a group of chief executives of housing associations only a couple of weeks ago, and one of them said to me, well, we're happy about housing people once they're on their feet. In the modern labour market, if you're lowly paid, you are never on your feet. You're always at risk of being knocked off your feet. So that's a huge difference from the world which many of us were facing and planning for 10 years ago. The second big change is one that I think we all should have seen coming. We all knew was coming. The data all told us it was coming. We have a very different population. The shape of our population is different from the one that many of our systems have been set up for. Everybody knows we have more people over 65 than under 16. That's a huge shift. But in some parts of the country, we are suddenly seeing a very rapid birth rate. That's a huge shift in particular pockets where that balance will change again. There are more people living with long-term medical conditions, living good, fulfilled lives with fluctuating conditions that make them able to work and not able to work. There are more people with mental health problems in the community than there have ever been before. All of these are tremendous victories for our social care system and for our medical system. They're things we should be celebrating. The fact that more profoundly disabled children live to adulthood is a huge success. We should be celebrating it. But it profoundly challenges our systems, our approaches, our expectations about how people will live and how they will work. And the nature of our places has changed too. You were describing, Jackie, some wonderful, resilient, vibrant communities, but we all know of parts of Scotland where industry has disappeared and nothing has taken its place, where people with skills and ability have gone and have left behind a poorer, older, more troubled population. We know that is true, and we know that increasingly, as our housing becomes allocated, our social housing becomes allocated at the point of need and emergency, not as a long-term asset to the community, those places will become more and more stigmatised, more and more difficult. We know those changes have happened, and they're all changes which, in our heart of hearts, I don't think surprise anyone. The question is, what does it mean for people and places in poverty? Changes in work, changes in the population, the shape of the population and the condition of the population, changes in the places we live in. Those are the backdrops against which we're meeting today. And for Joseph Rowntree Foundation, our starting point is to say, yes, of course there is deep, persistent and troubling poverty across the UK. It's not about them, it's about us. Poverty is all around us. Question is that inevitable? If you look at the manifestos of many, many political parties, you would sort of assume that even in this very wealthy country, that sort of level of poverty is inevitable, collateral damage for coming out of recession. For JRF, we profoundly don't believe that's the case. We believe it's not inevitable in any way. And we know that over the last 20, 30 years, we began to make some really important changes. And on each of those changes, we're in danger of reversing our gains. We were beginning to break the age-old tie-up between old age and poverty. It was, in the past, nearly always accepted that as you got old, you got very poor. help the aged pictures, old ladies huddled by the fire with a shawl around them. That was the image of old age. We were beginning to make progress on that, and year after year, reports from JRF and from all sorts of other organisations said that yes, there are still some older people who are very poor indeed, but it's no longer automatically linked. That's a historic change that this country, the UK, achieved, or began to achieve, and it is in grave danger. We began to break the link, the historic link between poverty and squalor. The idea that if you were poor, you would obviously live somewhere horrible. All sorts of schemes in Scotland and in England and indeed in Wales and Northern Ireland have started to change that. And it was beginning to be possible in the UK, alone in the developed world, I should say, to live in a decent home, paying a subsidised rent, maybe, but to be quite poor, but to live somewhere that wasn't squalid. That's a huge advance that we managed to make because of long-term sustained effort. We're beginning to go back on that one too. And the third big change that I have seen is that it was beginning to be possible to have a talk about poverty that was about prevention, it was about engagement, it was about people's whole lives. It wasn't about how do we stop people being destitute. And now we face food banks. And we face people living in absolute overcrowded squalor. In London, we see people living in beds in sheds. In Scotland, we see overcrowding and a growing private rented sector, which we reported on yesterday, which is largely unregulated, very, very expensive and not of a high standard. And we face the prospect that yet again, people who are now in their 30s and 40s, earning below the living wage, will face an old age of absolute penury. So gains we have made are being reversed, and they're being reversed as I speak. Now, all of that can leave us saying, what on earth can we do about it? What difference can we make? I believe very strongly that in that context of change, in this seventh richest country in the world, with our political consensus, because as Chris said earlier today, no politician thinks poverty is good. We can start to build a consensus which says we can defeat poverty, we can eradicate it. We can create systems that provide support for people through their lives, that recognise that our current rather volatile, rather tricky labour market will leave some people poor at some times, but that experience should be one of dignity, of respect, and short. If you lose a job, if you get divorced, if you become ill, all of these things will happen to many of us in this room. You may well be poor for a very short time. In a civilised country, that's for a very short time, and you can lead a life of dignity and respect and get help to get over that. It should be a short-term period in people's lives instead of the scar across the generation that we know poverty currently is. So I'm arguing that we can make these changes because we have. It's vital that we don't see poverty as something that's inevitable, that's always with us. It's real and it's not inevitable, as Nelson Mandela said. And the things that we can do about it are within our control. They are not in Westminster. They're not even here in Holyrood. They're not only with local authorities and they're not only with voluntary organisations, businesses and housing associations. Between us, if it becomes our organising purpose, and you have an opportunity in a poverty-free Scotland to make it your organising purpose, we can start to drive down the numbers of people who are poor, reduce the time in which anyone is poor, and make that experience one that is less damaging and less destructive than it is. And the areas I would suggest that we need to focus on are about the nature of work and what work looks like. Employing people who cannot survive on the wages that they are paid is a breach in the fundamental social contract. Households where people are working hard, doing what the government has told them to do, and are still unable to feed their children or plan with any certainty for the future, are not safe places to raise children. They're not safe places to plan for your old age. And they're absolutely not safe places to think about the risks of disability that we all face. Unless people are earning more than they need to subsist, they are in a very fragile place. So how work changes, which for me is not just about wages. The minimum wage, I believe, the living wage is necessary, but it's not sufficient. There are so many other things employers can do. And employers who recognise that we will never return to growth with the numbers and levels of poverty that we're facing today are beginning to engage with how can they make the experience of work one which enables their staff to be engaged, to be committed, to carry on working, to have an investment in that company. And they won't do it if they are struggling as much as many people who are now working are. So how we change the world of work, how we reconfigure it, how we make it suitable for that environment that I was talking about is critically important. Linked with that is a proper and shared discussion about what we do with people who are not working. Listening to the politicians here today, they all repeated the mantra that work is the best route out of poverty. And for many of us, most of the time it is. But not always, not for everyone, and not in every place. And people with fluctuating medical conditions may be able to work some of the time, not others. People will want to look after their older relatives sometimes and not others. They will want to care for their children. We need a grown-up and civilised conversation in a modern society about what's the safest way in which families organise themselves. The second thing I think we will need to look at is the costs. It's 30, 40 years ago, I think, that the seminal work, The Poor Pay More, was written. If you look at the cost facing poorer households, our research suggests they have gone up 25% in 3 years, because the cost that we all face of food, of fuel, of childcare, of housing, of finance, are the ones that take up the biggest part of the budgets of people who are not well paid or are living on low incomes. And that huge increase in costs, when we know poorer families and households are having to pay more, seems to me something that's within all of our grasp to address and to recognise that if you are on the living wage or even quite a bit above it and your washing machine breaks, that is a catastrophe for you as a household. If you then have to take out an extortionate loan because there's no other method of getting finance to replace your washing machine, you are trapped in a cycle of poverty from which you will not escape. So for me, the issue of cost is as close to the one of work and income, whether or not you're in work. How we address those costs seems to me a question for the market, certainly, for governments with their regulatory powers, certainly, but also for voluntary and community organisations who in many parts of the country are pioneering different ways of addressing those costs. And the third thing I think we need to look at is how we provide a system of support for people throughout their life course, dealing with the particular life events that all of us have, recognising that shocks in my life may shock me. Shocks in the life of somebody on a low income can ruin them forever. A sick child so you can't go to work for 2 months, an ageing parent, losing a job, all of those are bad news for everybody. We all need a system of insurance and protection that protects the dignity of people and places in poverty, allows them to change, to grow, to go through all the different phases of life and to deal with the shocks and accidents of our fast-changing world, and to do that in a way that is understandable, fair, and commands public support. I don't think any of those aspirations are outside our control. I don't think it's beyond us. Yesterday, the Westminster Parliament voted an eye-watering sum for HS2, a bit of infrastructure to link London with the north. It is not beyond our wits to see housing, childcare, and health support as part of that essential infrastructure, because unless we see it as part of that, we won't return to growth. We won't even return to the sort of prosperity that most of us think we deserve. Thank you very much.
Julia, thank you for a really compelling way of describing and explaining the changes and what the priorities might be. Just as a kind of quick link back to why JRF is the partner in this event this year, you'll have in your pack a really short note about the JRF's anti-poverty programme, and so the 6 themes we've been working on the last couple of days have all been about feeding into that. And I said it earlier, but I'll say it again, that JRF's commitment is by 2016 to produce kind of an independent look at what a properly evidenced and costed anti-poverty strategy for Scotland should look like. Now, it's up to not just politicians actually, but Julia's point, up to employers, housing providers, providers of low-cost loans and so on, training providers too, to work out what are the implications of this way of thinking if we're serious about having an anti-poverty mission at the heart of our work, and not just leaving it to politicians who come and go, who succeed and fail, to get it right. And so that's our commitment, regardless of the outcome of the referendum, regardless of election results. And you've heard just a flavour of where some of our thinking is at the moment. And where it goes will be very much influenced by what you've been telling us the last couple of days. Anyway, enough from me. We've got, Peter will tell me if I'm wrong on this, we've got about 10, maybe 15 minutes at most for your comments, questions, reflections. And thank you, I will. For your comments, questions and reflections on what you've heard so far, or any other points from the last day or so that you'd like to share with Jackie and Julia. And hopefully, I can pinch your roving mic, can't I? Because you've got these now. Thank you. Great. Do you want to take one? I'll just come here for the first question.
That's my question.
Do you want to ask this?
1 minute, hang on. Does Jenny want to ask a question as well?
Yes.
Right.
Go for it.
Okay.
There are two at the front.
What's the prospect for people with long-term mental illness and benefits? Because at the moment, the benefit system's all changed for people on long-term sick. They're getting interviewed by people who have no idea about mental illness, and they're deeming them fit for work just because they can make a cup of tea. Sometimes you can't see mental illness or mental distress, but these people aren't trained to do that because they're, just somebody that's coming along and interviewing you.
Should we take a couple and then come back? Okay. I'll come back to you in a second. And
I was just to Jackie. I'm from Castleton Housing Association, and we were awarded over £600,000 to set up the welfare reform team for the next 5 years. And it'll actually help a lot of our tenants. Thank you.
good, some grateful feedback there. And question you as well.
My question is, what about enforcing the laws that are already here? We've got anti-discrimination laws and they get ignored. We've got equality laws. And I just think even the new law, the neglect against children, if that was even enforced, but nobody enforces them.
Good point.
Thank you. And I've heard a similar point made about employment rights too. Sometimes we do have legal frameworks in place, but our issues about delivery. I'm going to come for more questions in a moment, but first I'm going to give Jackie and Julia a chance to respond.
I'm going to try and answer those too, because I think between you, you've met echo there. Can you hear me? Is that all right? I think one of the worst things that's happened over the last few years, and it's been going on longer than the last 5 years, is what's happened to people with particularly fluctuating and changing and invisible conditions. And I'm deeply disturbed by how it's been done. What will happen next, I don't know. I can't give you an easy answer because I'm not from government, but I do think we need to be gathering the evidence as you are doing today, and making sure that the really difficult experience that's held is expressed properly. What troubles me is that it's too easy to say that people who are disabled, mentally ill, or long-term medical conditions of any sort can't work. Many, many people I know well want to work, but the work needs to change. So you've got two areas where I think we need to really address it. One is how work's changed, and of course how it's assessed. It is a scandal that people are being assessed by people who don't know what they're looking for. I strongly agree with that. Which takes me to your point about the existing legislation. I think we should be really brave about the legislation that exists. There is anti-hate crime legislation, there is anti-discrimination, there's a human rights framework, and I think we have not applied those in the way that we could have done. And I don't see say we meaning Joseph Rowntree Foundation, all of us as a sector, and I think we need to.
Okay. Can we let Jackie have a chance to respond, and I will come back to you.
Yeah, I would agree and concur with a lot of what's been said. And I suppose if I think about where we have seen people being able to get either some support and some wins from not challenging the status quo, but actually making the law do what the law is supposed to do, I guess is in a number of areas around advocacy. And I guess one of the most powerful things that we've been able to do as a funder is put the ability to exact your rights and to make the law work in the hands of people who need that. And that could be, for example, in terms of your rights in relation to benefits, but equally your rights in relation to the law. And one of the most powerful things we funded recently has been around enabling, for example, women who are in the courts with a domestic abuse scenario to be able to access good legal advocacy so that they can make the law work for them. So I don't know how many people from an advocacy perspective or who are working for organisations where advocacy is part of what you do, but advocacy has a huge role to play in making the law work for people, but also make systems behave as they're supposed to behave. I know people who work in Citizens Advice Bureau will feel that they're doing that a lot at the moment, but I guess from a practical point of view, if you say, as you very powerfully do, the laws are there, they're not enforced, there is something for me about how we make sure that they are enforced where possible for the benefit of people who need them.
Thank you. Do you? Okay, great. Thank you. So there were some comments at the back. Yeah, there. I'll come to Franz.
Hi, this is directed to yourself, Jackie. First of all, I'd like to say thank you very much. You gave my organisation a wonderful grant as well. And what I'd like to say is you had a slide up there earlier when you were talking about Sport Connect, about advice and about community involvement. I'd like to tell you a wee bit about my experience. You gave my organisation funding for 3 staff members to start a financial capability programme. And what we've done with that is we have taken that out into our very rural community. And on the back of that, what we have found is when we've gone out to help people with that side of things, people have come to us with other issues. And what has actually happened is, in some of the areas I've been working in, we've gone into partnership with other groups in that area, and we have actually volunteers coming to us. And if I can mention specifically, in one of the little mining villages in the area I work in, where there's very high unemployment after the problems obviously in the 1980s, through our financial capability building, we ended up running a work club because that was what was needed to try and improve people's financial capacity, help with the welfare reforms. From that, we went into partnership with libraries who help with support through digital inclusion and such like. And from that, volunteers have come to us. They've set up their own fruit barra. We now have a community shop which was derelict before, which is now being actively used and is running 3 days a week, full time. And we now have an absolute community point. So the point I'm trying to make is that although you gave us money for advice, that when you take it out into the community and let communities speak, builds a community. They needed a focal point to come to. They didn't have one. And I must say thank you very much. You've made a big difference to our area.
And could you tell us who you are and where you're from? I was remiss earlier.
My name's Jackie. I'm from the Citizens Advice Bureau in Stirling.
Thank you, Stirling. Thank you very much.
That's great.
Okay, so other comments, questions? I'll go over here. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks very much. It's Rosemary Brocci from Shelter Scotland. One of the themes that's come up at different times throughout the last 2 days has been the fact that more and more people are having to turn to the private rented sector to find their homes. We know that the private rented sector in Scotland particularly is taking up the slack from decades of underinvestment in social renting, and that more and more people in housing need, very vulnerable people, are having to turn to private lets. But we also know that private renting is extremely expensive, that it's insecure, and that very often there are very poor conditions. So across Scotland, we've been looking at ways to regulate the sector, and I'm just wondering from your point of view, if there was one thing you could do to transform the sector, what would it be?
Can I just take one more?
Have a moment to think. Yes, please.
Before I give you some thinking time. Can I unfairly come to this man here, Francis? Yes. And the reason is, I was at the Scottish Parliament last week, at the Economy Committee, and your colleague Catherine was speaking about Oxfam's work, and she talked about Build Back Better, which has been a concept strongly used consistently in the international aid sector after natural disasters, and is now being applied to how we think about fair growth, a different kind of recovery, which both of you touched upon. But I wondered, Francis, if you want to take the opportunity just to say a word more about that, because it struck me as a really interesting way of framing a different pathway.
Like for me, I think, just coming back to these two presentations, I thought they were both they were excellent and very clear. What I think there was perhaps less of a focus on was one around the economy and how we do that Build Back Better, but also about we know the problems at the bottom in terms of wages and incomes, but we don't necessarily talk about the problems at the top. And do we need to? There is an increasing focus on inequality, but perhaps as an assembly we need to focus more on that and talk about wages at the top and things like a maximum wage as well as a minimum wage. So if we're talking about building back better, we also need to look at the top as well as the bottom.
Thank you. And if you could just pass the microphone to the woman at the next table, just here. Thank you for the final comment or question. Thank you.
I suppose mine's a bit different. Mine's for the people who are in the middle, the people who've worked, who then bought houses. Now, bearing in mind we actually have more privately owned houses in Britain than rented full stop, whether it's social or private. Where do we stand helping the people who've bought their house and then through an illness or long-term health illness, you've now got one person who's not working and they have no children, no benefits, no help. How do we move forward to help those people?
Thank you. And just tell us who you are, please.
My name's Susan Brown. I'm just a community activist in West Lothian. However, I also work for the Lloyds Banking Group in the Secure Collections Department.
You got that in just at the end. Thank you. So we've got some satisfied customers, which will be music to your ears, Jackie. And we've got some questions about housing insecurity, both private rented sector, but also that point of people who just miss out, who aren't poor enough and don't fall into the categories, but may nonetheless find themselves unable to protect against the kind of shocks that you talked about. And then this point about the gap, equality, wealth as well as income perhaps. So these are big running issues throughout the course of the last 2 days, and I just welcome your final reflections on any of them.
Can I just make one little point?
Really briefly, please.
We're talking about the benefit system for people with mental ill health.
Sorry, start again. There you go.
We're talking about the benefits of people with long-term mental illness. I mean, what's available now for getting them, like giving them benefits? Too late for some, because some people have had their benefit cut, their housing benefit cut, and they've ended up taking their own life because they don't know what's life's so unbearable because they've no money and they can't live. And it's too late for some.
Thank you very much indeed. A sobering reflection on where some of this gets us to. Thank you for, if you can comment on any of those.
Okay, I shall try and weave through them, and I guess I'd like to just, it's really good to hear from Castleton and from Stirling. It sounds to me, and did I get it correctly? Are you Jackie as well? Hello, Jackie. It sounds to me that what you're doing is building back better, actually, and that's terrific. And you have maybe picked on that point of that scale that we've got of the balance, and I suppose that's really what we're looking for, which is that opportunity where if we're having to go into something that's a bit disastrous, how do we give it stronger, better roots in a more positive way for the future? To me, although I'm not completely familiar with the Build Back Better model in international development terms, it sounds to me like that's what you're doing, and that's great to hear. And I'm sure somebody from one of my team will be coming to talk to you to look at writing that up, because that sounds like a great example. I wanted to pick up on the private rented sector point just a little bit. And I guess the biggest frustration from our perspective that we have is access. We work a lot with RSLs, with housing associations, but we don't have so many routes in. In fact, we have barely any routes in to people who are living in the private rented sector. And I would say that requires people in community organisations in the voluntary sector to be more resourceful and more imaginative on how they reach people who might be living in very precarious, in fact, who we know are living in beds in sheds and in overcrowded conditions and in unregulated conditions. The biggest challenge for us is access, and we're really interested in work that gives us access or gives organisations that can help access to those tenants. I think that would be the biggest thing. And finally, on that last point about it being too late, I suppose the only thing that I can say that we've seen and that we've tried to do is to increase the availability of resource, and I mean human resource. So it will seem very little, but we've increased our funding to helplines and networks of befrienders and support, I suppose, so that if people do find themselves in that situation where they feel they have no other options, there are more people that they can talk to. And I guess it's Julia's point about
they're just placed at the bank when they're trying to get money out.
Yeah.
It's not there, they've not been told, it's just not being paid into the bank.
I know.
Money there for them.
I appreciate that. I suppose I was picking up on Julia's point about what we can do, what everybody can do, and I suppose it is something around be more there for each other, and that's the only thing that we've seen on that.
Thank you. Julia?
I think you're right to remind us, of course you're right to remind us of the terrible tragedies caused by poverty, and I think we just have to hear what you say and recognise that's true, and it is dreadful and an appalling stain on our country that it happens. I think we just have to acknowledge it. I want to go on to this issue of housing because I think it relates back to that. It is about the insecurity in which so many people live. There was a time when people in social housing felt secure. The private rented sector didn't feel so secure, and people in home ownership felt secure depending whether they could manage it or not. In all 3 tenures now, there is a feeling of precariousness, a feeling of risk. So the question from Shelter Scotland, I want to have 2 and maybe 3. And in fact, I'm going to take 3, pretend I'm on Desert Island Disc. Of course, I want more supply. We need more housing because it's undersupply that's driving silly prices in some parts of Scotland and a very badly performing private rented sector. So of course, we need to build more. I predict that we will end up with some form of rent control more than we've had in the past. There is not JRF evidence on this. Supply, I can show you the evidence. On rent control, you have to trust my guts. I just think if more and more people in the private rented sector, there will have to be some sort of control. How and when and which government will take the step first, I don't know. But it does seem to me to be coming. And the third is this point for homeowners. I think we have created an appalling, I was going to say hollow bubble, all bubbles are hollow, a really dangerous position for homeowners. We know from JRF research that you are most likely to suffer poverty and your income will have come down most if you're precisely the people you're talking about. Working age people without children are at the hardest position. If they've managed to buy somewhere and then find it difficult to pay for it, simply can't pay for it, are in an area where they can't sell, have no other options, they're in an extraordinarily difficult position. So my third wish for the Good Fairy on housing would be some much more sophisticated way of supporting people who get into difficulty as homeowners. Because we've had a period of 30 years of being encouraged, if you possibly can, you should buy. And then people left absolutely stranded. There was a headline in The Guardian yesterday that said negative equity has come to an end. And the pictures were of negative equity having come to the end in the south of England, in the entire north of England, and my guess is Scotland. Negative equity is a very real thing. And unless we have some means of intervening and protecting people and allowing them to make better judgments at that stage, we're leaving them on their own. Oh, and Build Back Better, sorry. I knew I'd written my notes down. I couldn't understand what I was saying. One of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation programmes that has learnt hugely from overseas development thinking is one about cities, growth and poverty, and trying to look at how cities returning to growth
can do better for poor people and poor places than just to transplant them. My experience of rapid growth in the 80s and the 90s, and indeed the early 2000s in different parts of the UK, was the areas returned to growth, looked very wealthy, and poor people were either hidden away or displaced. And we, working with the Leeds City region and other partners, are trying to explore what would growth look like, a return to growth which didn't discriminate against poor people, didn't just leave them marginalised, and didn't just dislocate them. That's learning from overseas development, and I think Build Back Better is absolutely where we need to be. Thank you. Julia and Jackie, 3 words, I think these are 3 words, no, it's 4 words: thought-provoking, inspiring and practical. And 2 more, thank you. Please join me in thanking our speakers.